If you heard soft cries coming from the freezing woods, would you risk everything to answer them? John Whitaker, a 62-year-old widower from rural Wisconsin, had never imagined that a simple walk could change his life forever. His days had been quiet lately, marked by long hours tending to his late wife's neglected garden. But that cold December afternoon, the silence was broken by a sound that pulled at something deep inside him. John lived alone now, his house filled only with the ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of old wooden floors. Every morning, he forced himself through the motions: coffee, reading the paper, staring blankly out the window, waiting for a purpose he feared might never come. His children lived out of state, visiting only on holidays, their lives bustling while his seemed frozen in time. It had been 3 years since Margaret's passing, but the grief sat heavy, like fresh snow refusing to melt. That day, John bundled up against the bitter wind, pulling his late wife's scarf around his neck like a shield. He needed fresh air, even if it meant facing the loneliness that seemed sharper in the winter. The woods behind his home had always been a place of comfort for him, filled with memories of hikes with Margaret and laughter echoing between the trees. But today, the forest felt different, restless, almost calling to him. As he trudged along a narrow, icy trail, a faint, trembling sound reached his ears. At first, he thought it was just the wind slipping through the trees. But when he stopped to listen, the cry came again, weak, desperate, and unmistakably alive. His heart raced as he peered into the thick brush, trying to locate the source of the heartbreaking noise. Instinct overruled reason. John knew he couldn't just ignore it. Pushing past thorny branches, John followed the plaintive cries until he stumbled upon a small clearing. There, curled up and shivering against the roots of a fallen oak, was a tiny fawn, no bigger than a house cat. Its legs were awkwardly twisted beneath it, and its big wet eyes stared up at him, filled with terror and pain. The baby deer was utterly alone, no sign of its mother, no herd, just the biting cold and growing darkness. John dropped to his knees without thinking, his gloves brushing snow from the fawn's frail body. It was breathing, but barely. Each exhale a puff of desperate steam in the frozen air. The fawn let out another weak bleat, struggling to lift its head before collapsing again. John's chest tightened painfully. It was too young, too fragile to survive another night out here alone. And there was no way he could pretend he hadn't seen it. 1,000 doubts flooded John's mind at once. Was it legal to help a wild animal? What if the mother was nearby and would return? What if trying to help only made things worse? But then the fawn let out another soft cry, and John's doubts melted away. He couldn't leave it to die slowly, frozen and forgotten. Not after everything he had lost, not after all the life he had once cherished and lost himself. Carefully, John slid his arms under the tiny body, feeling how shockingly light and cold it was. The fawn didn't resist, too weak to even struggle, as he lifted it against his chest. His heart pounded as he looked back toward his house, the fading light making every shadow seem longer, every step more urgent. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he had to do something. The walk back felt endless, the cold slicing through John's coat and numbing his hands. He could feel the fawn's heartbeat fluttering weakly against his chest, a small, fragile thread connecting their lives. By the time he reached his porch, John was shaking, partly from the cold, partly from the enormity of what he was about to do. He looked down at the fawn, its eyes fluttering closed, and made a silent promise he couldn't fully explain. Just as he stepped inside, cradling the deer like a sacred thing, the distant sound of a car engine echoed down the road. John froze in the doorway, clutching the bundle tighter. He didn't know it yet, but that decision, the moment he chose compassion over caution, would soon put everything he had left on the line. John laid the fawn gently on an old quilt by the fireplace, his hands trembling from more than just the cold. The little creature barely moved, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic breaths. John grabbed towels and warmed water, unsure if what he was doing was right, but desperate to give the fawn a chance. He had lost too much in life to lose this little soul too. As he rubbed the fawn dry, John noticed the deep scratches along its side and the unnatural angle of its back leg. It must have been attacked or fallen hard. Either way, it wouldn't survive without care. The sight of the injuries made John's stomach twist in helpless fury. He whispered softly to the deer, promising it that it wasn't alone anymore. Just as John was wrapping the fawn in the second blanket, headlights swept across his living room window. His neighbor, Mr. Harris, was pulling into his driveway across the road. John instinctively moved the fawn out of sight, his heart pounding. In their small town, word traveled faster than fire, and not everyone would understand what he was doing. It wasn't just about gossip. It was against the law to keep wild deer without special permits. Wildlife officers could fine him heavily, or worse, take the animal away. John had seen it happen before. He had heard the stories of deer being euthanized because rehab wasn't possible. The thought of this fragile life ending like that filled him with dread. As night deepened, John called the local wildlife rescue center, but the line rang endlessly with no answer. An automated voice finally informed him that they were closed until Monday, 3 days away. John sat by the fire, watching the fawn shiver despite the warmth, feeling the crushing weight of the decision ahead. If he took it to the authorities, the fawn would likely be put down. He couldn't sleep that night, his mind a battlefield of worry and hope. The fawn needed food, shelter, and care, things John wasn't trained to give. Yet when he looked at it, curled so trustingly against the warmth, he knew he couldn't abandon it to bureaucratic indifference. Margaret had always said, "If you can help, you must." The words echoed in his chest like a drum. The next morning, John drove cautiously into town to buy supplies: goat's milk, baby bottles, medical gauze. At the checkout counter, the cashier gave him a strange look but said nothing. Every minute, John feared someone would ask questions, someone would notice too much. But he pressed on, driven by something far greater than fear, a sense of duty he couldn't explain. When he returned, the fawn tried to lift its head, its ears twitching weakly. The sight sent a jolt of fierce protectiveness through John's veins. He prepared a tiny bottle, his hands shaking, and managed to coax a few precious drops into the fawn's mouth. For the first time, John allowed himself a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could keep it alive. Later that afternoon, as John sat rocking the fawn in his arms, a knock rattled the front door. He stiffened instantly, heart hammering in his ears. Through the frosted glass, he could see the dark silhouette of a sheriff's deputy standing outside. John's blood ran cold. Someone must have reported him. The choice he had made, the risk he had taken, was now staring him straight in the face. John rose slowly, tightening his arms around the fragile body tucked against him. He knew he couldn't hide, and he wouldn't lie. He had made his choice the moment he lifted the fawn from the snow. Taking a deep breath that shook in his chest, John opened the door, ready to face whatever would come. Deputy Mills stood on the porch, his hand resting on his belt, his face unreadable. John braced himself, cradling the bundled fawn tighter against his chest. "We got a call about a possible wildlife violation," Mills said, his voice low, almost apologetic. John nodded slowly, feeling the full gravity of his actions settling on his shoulders. Without waiting for permission, Mills stepped inside and spotted the fawn immediately. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the trembling little body swaddled in blankets. "This isn't legal, John," he said finally, voice softer than John expected. John nodded again, unable to form words past the lump in his throat. The deputy's eyes flickered, as if fighting an internal battle. But sometimes, Mills added quietly, doing the right thing isn't exactly by the book. He crouched down, studying the fawn's pitiful state. "She wouldn't have survived the night," he murmured, almost to himself. John watched, hardly daring to hope, as the officer sighed heavily and stood. "I have to report this," Mills said, his tone heavy with reluctance. "But I'll note you acted in good faith. Maybe that'll help." John could only nod, gratitude and fear warring in his chest. As Mills left, he paused in the doorway and said, "Take care of her, John. She's your responsibility now." And just like that, John knew he had been given a fragile second chance. Over the next few days, John threw himself into caring for the fawn, who he named Hope. Feeding her, changing her makeshift bandages, keeping the fire burning, it gave John's days a rhythm, a purpose he hadn't felt since Margaret passed. Hope's strength slowly returned, her eyes growing brighter, her tiny legs trembling less each time she tried to stand. It was messy, exhausting, and utterly transformative. Neighbors whispered, of course. Some dropped hints about calling wildlife officials again. But others, like Mrs. Cartwright, the widow down the street, left bags of supplies at his doorstep anonymously. John realized not everyone saw the law as black and white. Some hearts, he thought, still recognized mercy when they saw it. One afternoon, as John was coaxing Hope to sip from a bottle, his daughter Ellie called. She hadn't heard his voice sound so alive in years. "Dad," she said tearfully after hearing about Hope. "Mom would be so proud of you." The words broke something open inside John. A dam he hadn't even realized was holding back all his grief, his guilt, his need to be needed again. Hope grew stronger each day, following John around the house like a shadow. She'd nuzzle his elbow when she was hungry, curl against his feet when she was tired. For the first time in so long, John laughed, real, belly-deep laughter, when Hope clumsily tried to climb onto his worn-out recliner. Life was seeping back into the house, into him, one wobbly step at a time. Then, just when it seemed like things might settle, an official letter arrived from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. John sat at his kitchen table, the envelope trembling in his hands. Inside was a formal notice. He would be charged for unlawful possession of wildlife. Court date pending. His heart sank, and he looked over at Hope, who blinked at him with trusting, innocent eyes. John realized then that saving her would require more than blankets and bottles. It would take a fight, one he hadn't known he still had the strength for. As he scratched Hope behind the ears, feeling the small life he had vowed to protect, he whispered, "We're in this together, little one." No matter what. John didn't waste a moment. He reached out to a local lawyer, a family friend who had once gone hunting with Margaret. Together, they started preparing a defense based not on denial, but on compassion. John's mission wasn't to escape punishment. It was to prove that mercy had a place in the law too. The story spread faster than anyone expected. A neighbor's teenage grandson posted about John and Hope on social media, and within days the town was buzzing. News outlets picked it up. Widower faces jail for saving orphaned fawn. Support flooded in, from letters slipped under his door to strangers offering donations for legal fees. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was packed with people. Some he knew, many he didn't. Hope, now stronger but still small, waited in the back with Ellie, her big brown eyes melting every heart that met her gaze. When John stood before the judge, he didn't plead for himself. He spoke about kindness, about loss, about what it meant to hold on to life when everything else seemed lost. The judge listened carefully, his face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he dismissed the charges, citing extraordinary humanitarian circumstances. The courtroom erupted in quiet cheers. Even the stern prosecutor managed a reluctant smile. John didn't cry, not there, but when he stepped outside into the cold sun, he bent down and hugged Hope tightly, tears streaming freely. Back home, John realized he couldn't just return to his old lonely life. Inspired by Hope, he started volunteering at a wildlife rehabilitation center newly opened by the town council. Hope, still too bonded to be released into the wild, stayed by his side, becoming a beloved mascot for the center. Together, they taught children about compassion, resilience, and second chances. Their days were filled with new routines, feeding rescued animals, giving talks at schools, planting gardens to help the local deer population thrive. Every small act, every small life mattered now in a way John had never fully understood before. Hope remained his constant companion, trotting at his side, a living symbol of why none of it could be given up on. Neighbors who once whispered now volunteered. Children who once laughed now listened intently when John spoke about empathy. Hope had stitched together not just John's heart, but the hearts of an entire community. Where once there had been suspicion, there was now unity. All because one man refused to walk away from a life that needed him. On quiet evenings, John would sit on the porch, Hope resting her head on his knee, and watch the sunset burn orange behind the woods. Sometimes he still missed Margaret so deeply it hurt, but now there was a new thread woven into his life, one of hope, healing, and purpose. The cold silence that once filled his home had been replaced by warmth he thought he'd lost forever. One evening, as John scratched Hope behind the ears and felt her lean into his hand, he realized something powerful. He hadn't just saved a broken fawn on a freezing day. In reaching out with both hands to save a life smaller than his own, he had finally, painfully, beautifully saved himself. Because sometimes saving the smallest soul is what teaches us how to live again.